We're in law number 5 of the 10 Commandments. And we're taking these commandments and we're seeing how they apply to the I, human. The I, human. And this one, Paul writes about in Ephesians chapter 6. In fact, he quotes it. So I want to just read it to you, not from Exodus, but from the quote in Ephesians chapter 6. It goes like this: "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for it is right." That means it's the right thing to do. "Honor your mother and father, which is the first commandment with a promise, that it may be well with you and that you may live long on the earth. And you, fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and the admonition of the Lord." My dad was a rocket scientist. Now, I mean, really, he was a rocket scientist. He worked for NASA. He helped put people on the moon. He was in charge of all the wiring of that first, you remember when they shot the monkey up? Some of you weren't even born then. But anyway, he was in charge of all the wiring on that thing, and it had a lot of wiring in that rocket. But he was in charge of that. He was a smart guy. And yet the whole time I was a teenager, I thought he was the dumbest man on the planet. I think it was my second year of college. I came home for a holiday, and I think like Thanksgiving, and we arranged to have lunch together, and I went out to the field, out to where his office was, and I got there a little early, and the door was open to his office, but he was having a meeting in there. He had about 8 people in the office with him, and he was sitting behind his desk, and they were all sitting around his desk, and I remember as I listened, I went, man, there's a lot of smart people in that room. And then it just kind of rolled over me like my dad's leading that group. And then I remember thinking, my dad's a rocket scientist. Man, it blew me away. And as I sat there out there in that little hallway, I remember thinking back to when he used to take us as kids to the base with him, when he was in the Army too. And all these people would salute him and stuff. Later I found out that being a lieutenant colonel is not all that shabby in the Army. But it dawned on me, my second year of college, that guy that I thought was a complete idiot was smart, and he was a leader of men in the world. He was a rocket scientist. And I had a good dad. Got a good mom. She's 95 now. But you know, this commandment, to honor your mother and father, it's a hard one. It's a hard one for a lot of people because their parents, well, they weren't what they were supposed to be. For a lot of people, their parents were absentee. They just weren't there. For others, they were there physically, but emotionally they were unplugged. So they were emotionally absentee parents. But for some people, they've had parents that are harsh and mean. For others, they were downright brutal and abusive. And what happens is a lot of parents die before the healing can begin, before the reconciling can begin. Greg, a friend of mine, came up to me one day and said, "Look, I want you to see this movie. It's called Field of Dreams." This was back in 1989 when it first came out. "You got to see this movie, Field of Dreams. You got to see it. You got to see it." And he stayed after me for weeks. And finally, on Father's Day, he comes up to me and says, "We're going to go see that movie. We're going to go see it today." I said, "Man, I got Father's Day stuff to do." He said, "Well, get it done, and then we're going to go see this movie." So we went to the Late Show, and we saw the movie, and it was a good movie. It was a good movie. I appreciated it, but I couldn't understand why it was so important for him. So I took him for some coffee after the movie. I said, "All right, now debrief this with me for a minute. Why was it so important that I see that movie?" He said, "Because that movie describes my relationship with my dad." If you've seen the movie, you remember that it's about Ray Kinselis, who's played by Kevin Costner. And he was a guy whose relationship with his dad went sour early on. In fact, he got to the place where he wouldn't even play catch with his dad. And the movie is about how the whole cosmos sort of comes together to reconcile him with his dad. Even though his dad had died, and when he died, he didn't even go to his funeral. But you might remember the voice said to him, "Plow down your corn and build a field." And so he built this field, a field of, it was a baseball field, his dad's favorite sport. And as the movie goes on, the ghost of the baseball heroes that his dad idolized came and played on the field. And then at the end of the movie, finally, his dad shows up, the ghost of his dad. And at the very end of the movie, Kevin Costner says, "Hey, Dad, want to have catch?" And everybody in the theater cries. Now, the reason we cry at that kind of movie is because it resonates with us. You see, the Bible says that God put eternity in our hearts. And so when we hear these stories, we see these movies, we read these books that touch on eternity, it resonates with us. And you see, we know deep down inside that the whole cosmos really is coming together so that we can be reconciled to our Heavenly Father. Well, now let me tell you about my dad. My dad died 30 years ago this coming December. But 30 years ago, they gathered all of us, the family, the doctors did, and they said, "He's got 2 weeks to live." 2 weeks. Well, what do you do when you got 2 weeks to live? Well, you might be surprised that he didn't go skydiving or Rocky Mountain climbing. He didn't do 2.7 seconds on a bull named Fu Manchu. But what we did do is that my brother and I rented a cottage in Nag's Head, and we put balloons and streamers, and we just, for a week of this 2 weeks, we're going to celebrate life. And so Dad came down, the rest of the family came, and we spent a whole week trying to celebrate life. Well, my dad didn't die in 2 weeks. In fact, he lived another 18 months. And of those 18 months, 16 of those were really, well, pretty good quality of life. The last 2, they were tough months. But those 16 months may have been the best months of his life. Because even though my dad was a rocket scientist and a leader of men, at home, well, he was just really easy to take advantage of. He was quiet, mild-mannered. My mother has one of these strong personalities where the world just sort of naturally revolves around her. But man, when the doctor said he's going to die, the axis of our world changed, and all of a sudden, he was the center of our world. And I think he really enjoyed that. But what was great about those 16 months is that we had a chance to say all the things that we needed to be saying long before that. We had a chance to reconcile. We had a chance to say those things we needed to. We had a chance to show one another love on a deeper level. But you know, a lot of people don't get that chance. A lot of people don't get that blessing. Their parents just disappear too quickly. And so a lot of stuff is just hanging out there. Another thing that's kind of sad is a lot of people never take the steps to try to say those things while they still got their parents. For me, the last couple of years have been Remember Dad. Now, he died 30 years ago, but for some reason, over the last couple of years, I've been real interested in trying to figure out who he was before I was born, when he was a young man. And so he fought in the Battle of the Bulge, so I've seen a lot of World War II movies and read a lot of World War II books. My brother and I, we went to see one of the last shuttles launch, you know, and we went all through the Space Center there, and we looked at everything, and I'd never done that before. You know, usually you go through those kind of things at 15 miles an hour, but I really took time and checked it out. And my brother and I, it was just kind of a Remember Dad kind of trip for us. It was pretty cool. You know, this whole parenting thing, it's really a setup for disaster. It really is. A couple of reasons for that is, well, one, there are no professional parents. You know, you don't get a chance to raise a set of kids, see how they turned out, go back and raise another set, see how they turned out, go back and raise another set. You know, if we were able to do about 5 sets of kids and see, we could probably tweak this thing a little bit and figure it out a little better. But there are no professional parents. For the most part, it's guesswork. And most of us, we had our kids when we were young. Still had a whole lot to learn in life. And yet here we are trying to teach kids about life. Another reason why it's a setup for disaster is because, well, for men, kids seem to come into our lives while we're still angry young men. You know, ladies, you don't know this, but there's a time in most men's life where subconsciously the realization comes that all their dreams are not going to come true. They're not going to be a professional football player. They're not going to be an astronaut. They're going to not make their first $1 billion in the first 2 years they start a career. It's just, well, the idea that we're going to be more normal than we ever dreamed of kind of hits us. And what it does, it produces within us this kind of slow burning anger. And that seems to be when kids come into our lives. Can you see how it's a setup for disaster? And then, of course, there's that thing that kids are supposed to pull away. I mean, it's all set up so that when they start out, they are totally dependent on you, but they need to pull away. And so, in fact, the folks that are professionals at this, you know, the ones that are counselors and stuff, they draw pictures like okay, they're totally dependent here, but as time goes on, they become more and more independent until they become adults. But usually it doesn't work like that. Usually it's much more of a roller coaster than that nice straight line stuff. And kids, you know, they have this way of kind of asserting their independence a little bit early. I've been doing a study on this with my grandkids, and I have figured out when kids start asserting themselves, it's at the age of 18 months, you know? That's when it starts. And then parents have this idea that they're supposed to be in control. And so kids think they're supposed to be independent. Parents think they're supposed to be in control. Can you see where the train wreck in slow motion happens? Well, I will say this. It's nearly impossible for a kid to get through childhood, for anybody to get through childhood, without their parents wounding them in some way. You see, every word that comes out of a parent's mouth is a potential arrow. And there are forces at work that make sure those arrows hit the softest parts of a kid's heart. So it's nearly impossible for us to get through childhood without our parents wounding us in some way. I remember when my dad, while I was in college, I was in engineering. I was kind of following in his footsteps without even knowing it. And then I heard this call to preach, and I remember calling home and telling my parents about that. And this was back before cell phones, so they were on extensions. You know, one was in one room with a phone, and the other one was in another room with a phone, and they're listening to me as I go through this long exclamation of why I'm changing majors and that God had called me. And when I had finished making my announcement, I remember my mother said a whole lot. I mean, she talked a lot. And ladies, I'm sorry, but I don't remember a thing she said. But I remember my dad cleared his throat finally and said, and all he said, this is all he said on the phone. He said, well, if you're going to be a preacher, don't be a lazy preacher like our preacher. And that's all he said. Now, was he shooting at me? No. In fact, he liked their preacher. That week, he was having a little adjustment problem. But he threw that out. But you see, those forces, and you know, our enemy really is out to kill and steal and destroy. He took those words, formed it into an arrow, and hit me. And I have struggled with workaholism my whole life. You may have heard me last week just talk to you with passion about taking a Sabbath because I was talking to me. When my dad died, he died on a Tuesday, and he was buried on a Thursday, but that Wednesday in between, that's when they had the viewing. But I didn't go to the viewing because I had a Bible study to teach, and I wasn't going to be a lazy preacher. That's pretty sad. He didn't mean that. But you see, the power of a parent's words are amazing. And so Paul says, fathers, don't provoke your children to wrath. Now, this commandment to honor your parents has promises with it. It has two. In Exodus, it says it like this, that your days may be long. In other words, you'll live a while. Now, back then, everybody was a barbarian, and, your parents, what was it Bill Cosby said? I brought you into this world, and I'll take you out. They sort of took that more literally then. So obeying your parents really did help you live a little longer. But Paul, when he takes this and works with it, he says, he interprets it like this. Honor your mother and father, that it may go well with you, and you may enjoy life. I think this is almost like a magic wand. When you honor your parents, it just opens a door for blessing. God is not kidding about these promises. If you will honor your parents, it's amazing how it opens up your life for blessing. When I was in my late 20s, God really started working on me about this. Because frankly, I wasn't honoring my parents. And it was more than just lip service. He was saying to me, he wanted me to change my attitude. Because, man, I had really gotten a nasty attitude, especially toward my dad. That parable in Matthew 20 it's the thing that spoke to me. That parable is the one where a father has two sons, and he goes to one son, and he says, will you go out and work for me in the field? And the son says, sure, I'll do that, Dad, but then he never goes. And then he goes to the other one and says, will you go work in the field for me? And the other one says, no way, Jose. But then later he has a change of heart and he goes and works in the field. I should have never let my son learn that. When he was small, somehow he learned that parable. And we sort of had this thing going where I'd tell him to go do something, and he'd say, no! And then he'd run and do it before I caught up with him, But God was saying to me through that parable, you need to change your attitude. You need to change your attitude. And it doesn't mean not just lip service, not just, I honor your mom and dad, but the attitude change. And when I did that, it was like a door opened up for blessing in my life. You see, the flip side of that, Paul makes very clear. When he gives us that commandment, he adds immediately behind that, he says, so fathers, don't provoke your children to wrath. What he's saying, we all know that teenagers have this special gift. Y'all have a special gift at this, of pushing our buttons, Well, Paul here is saying parents know how to push buttons too, and to quit it. You see, when you act in a way towards your kid where you build that relationship and you make it easier for them to honor you, you're making it easier for them to have that blessing in their life when they honor their parents. Well, now, this commandment kind of changes as time goes on. In fact, as you read this commandment through the Scripture, at one place it says honor, another place it says obey. Well, it kind of changes as you grow. Like as a child, you follow this commandment by obeying your parents. As an older teenager, it becomes more of respecting your parents and cooperating with them. But when you become an adult, it becomes more of a treasure your parents. That's really important as they get older. Because frankly, when people get older, well, their friends die, the marketplace devalues them, their options narrow. So how do you treasure your parents when you're an adult and they're older? Well, stay in touch. I called my mom this morning. She's 95. I call her most Sunday mornings because I want her to pray for me. She says she will, but I just want to remind her. I'm preaching today. Make sure you pray. And she's pretty good about calling me Sunday night or Monday and finding out how it went. But stay in touch. Also advise them. I have found out with my 95-year-old mom, she has not yet gotten to the age where I can tell her what to do. I remember when me and my siblings, we had decided it was time for her to move out of her house and go live at a place that had a little more care to it, and she wasn't going to do it. We couldn't make her do it. But the day she decided, I have an idea, I think I ought to go live over here, we got the stuff together real fast and helped it out. But when you treasure your parents, you advise them. You say, Mom, Dad, this is what I think would be best. Another thing is to try to meet their emotional needs. For a lot of older people, Their kids are the brightest part of their life because life has taken away a whole lot of other stuff. So try to meet their emotional needs. And what I mean by that is not just give them the obligated hug that you give them when you see them, but really act like you're glad to see them. And when you leave, instead of just doing what everybody does, I love you, put some heart into it. Love them and cherish them. It's amazing to me how my mom has just flourished as me and my siblings have tried to really love her. Also, another part of that honoring them is financial. Yeah, financial. I know we have Social Security systems, but originally the word honor meant money. In fact, Jesus, he modeled this from the cross. Now, he is hanging on a cross. He doesn't say a whole lot when he's up on the cross, but most of his words that he says, the longest really conversation he has, which is pretty short, is with his disciple John, where he basically says to John, I need you to take care of my mom because I'm not going to be able to now. Now, when he went to the trouble to model this from the cross and through the pain of the cross, this was important to him. So honor them. Honor them if for nothing else, because of the time and the energy and the money they've put into you. It takes time and it takes energy. Watch some of these young moms around here. Gosh, the energy. My grandsons are, this tall. When they come to the house, the energy level goes through the roof. When they leave, all the energy's gone. But parents put a lot of energy into you. Honor them for that. Honor them for the money they put into it. I've got a friend that actually kept track of how much, to the penny, how much money it cost him to raise his kids. He said to me, each kid cost me $1.7 million. Whoa! I think you could do it cheaper than that. I think you could do it for $1.2 million, But they put time, they put energy into you, so honor them for that. I know some of you are looking at me and going, but man, you don't know my parents. As one guy said to me, if Moses had known my parents, he'd have written another commandment. But seriously, I have walked with people that I don't know how in the world they honored their parents. When I heard of the stuff they did to their kids, I don't know how they did that. But you see, this commandment doesn't have any conditions to it. It doesn't say if they were good parents. It doesn't say if they were deserving. It just says, honor your mother and father. But preacher, you don't know how they ignored me. You don't know how they brutalized me. You don't know how they violated me. How can you tell me to honor my parents? Well, I have walked with those who haven't honored their parents. And I can tell you by watching them that bitterness does not work. Bitterness just nails your feet to the floor. Now, I'm not asking you to stay in an abusive situation. For heaven's sake, don't hear that in what I'm saying. But you got to find ways to honor them. Ladies, if you don't make peace in your heart with your father, then you're going to project all of that junk into your marriage. And men, if you don't make peace in your heart with the stuff that happened to you when you were growing up, you're not only going to project it into your marriage, you're just going to project that junk into your kids' lives. So honor your mother and father. So how do you get past that? How do you get past those bitter feelings? Well, first of all, I just say admit it. Go ahead, admit that your family was no Norman Rockwell painting. Admit it. You might even want to write some of that down and describe it. And then once you've admitted it and you've kind of gotten it all out, then take time to grieve. Go ahead and hurt and grieve and cry. Counselors say it takes between 3 to 6 months of that hurting, grieving stuff to really take. But after you get past that, then go and talk to them. Discuss it. Now, I will tell you, sometimes it will take more than once, because usually the first time you go and talk to them about it, the defenses go up pretty quick. The denial, they'll say that never happened. They'll start rationalizing like crazy. So it might take a couple of times. In fact, most of the time, when you do this, it will do you good, but it won't be the big reconciling moment that you think it's going to be. But it's still important that you do that. Now, if your parent has died, if they're deceased, if they're incapacitated, if their mind has gotten to that place where they can't handle a conversation like that anymore, then maybe you can just write them a letter. One that you never mail. I mean, you might want to take it and share it with a sibling or a trusted friend, but discuss it with them. Tell them the things that hurt you the most. Now, if you're a parent and your kids come to you and they want to have that discussion, let me just tell you how to handle that. First of all, realize that it's almost impossible for a kid to get through childhood without being wounded by you. That's just reality. And so don't get defensive about it. Listen, and listen carefully. And try to take it all in. And don't get defensive. Don't deny it. I mean, really the best thing you can say is, man, I'm sorry you felt that way. I'm sorry you took it like that. We were young, we were ignorant, we didn't know what we were doing. I'm sure we made a whole lot more mistakes than that trying to raise you. But please know how much we love you. But most of the time you won't get that in return when you go and talk to your parents. But one way or the other, the next step is to forgive them. Whether they ask for forgiveness or not, forgive them. And the best way to kind of get that going is to try to understand what they were going through. Try to understand that they were very young when they had you. That they didn't know. Most of the time, they haven't thought through the repercussions of what they did to you. Most of the men I talk to that have abused their kids in some way, they did not think through what that would do to that kid's psyche. Try to understand it. You know, a lot of them were abused themselves, and they're just acting that out. They never broke that chain, that curse. But try to understand their humanness. I'm not saying you're going to understand, but try to understand. I know it's hard to forgive. In fact, I think that's why I appreciate that God forgave me. Because I know how hard it is to forgive. But Jesus said, as you forgive, you will be forgiven. So it's something we got to do. So the whole cosmos really does come together to try to reconcile us to our Heavenly Father. And part of that is being reconciled to our parents. And so Kevin Costner picks up his glove, grabs a baseball, says, "Hey, Dad, want to have catch?" I got some baseballs up here, and if God's been doing something in your heart, and you may need to reconcile with your parents, or maybe take one of these to your kid and say, "I want us to have a good relationship." While he sings, why don't you come up and get one?